It's a Saturday morning. A young couple are at the kitchen table having a cup of coffee together. Did I mention that the young lady with her husband was a blonde? It doesn't really matter, but she was. So they're reading the paper, and suddenly the young woman bursts into tears. "Honey, what's wrong?" She reads the headline from the news article. 2 Brazilian men die while skydiving when their parachutes fail. Well, the husband tries to comfort her. "Now, honey, you have to understand people should be more responsible and know that there is a risk in skydiving." Through her tears, she replies, "But that's a lot of people. How many are 2 Brazilian?"
Shut that off, will ya?
Let's take a look at our Bibles this morning. In my devotions, I've been going through Ecclesiastes, written by King Solomon. And I came to chapter 10 and one verse, and it reminds me of some of the dangers that we can encounter in this life. You know, like not packing your parachute properly, or ignoring certain signs. We sometimes want to tear down a wall or two, and there could be a danger in that. To help us understand the lesson that we find in Ecclesiastes, first of all, we need just a little bit of background. So for that, we have to go back 3,000 years. We're in Israel. King Solomon is in charge, and things are going all right. There's peace in the land, no droughts, people are prospering, they got a pretty good king. And one of the major occupations at this time is farming. Now, farming wasn't that easy 3,000 years ago. It was a tough business. Farmer worked from sunup to sundown 6 days a week, took the Sabbath day off to go to church. He was either growing grain or olives or grapes that would become wine. It's with the grapes that we have a lesson here for us this morning. So it's harvest season, time to gather the grapes in, make wine. And because the farms are out in the country, away from the king and all the soldiers that would protect them, they have to protect themselves and protect their crops. And so what they would do is they would build these stone walls, loose stone walls, around the vineyards. And they would also add bramble bushes that would grow up on the walls and with sharp thorns. And this was kind of a home security system to protect their crops. Now, as an added feature, they would allow poisonous snakes to live within the cracks in the walls. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine anybody in their right mind that would want to sneak over one of the walls and steal some grapes? So we read in verse 8, King Solomon has something to say. He's been surveying his kingdom and looking at the farmers working, and one day he writes down in verse 8, "When you dig a well, you might fall in it. When you demolish an old wall, you could be bitten by a snake." When you demolish an old wall, there's a chance you might be bitten by a snake. The NIV reads, "Whoever breaks through the wall or tears it down, you will be bitten." The universe in which we live in is governed by a higher law. God has placed us in a world that is surrounded, you may not know this, by a protective wall. If you were here last week and you listened to my message, then I mentioned how the scientists are puzzled over this theory of the Big Bang. When the universe began, when God called everything into being, he created matter and antimatter. Now, scientists don't add God in their theory, but we know who created the universe. And they're puzzled because with equal amounts of matter and antimatter, it should have canceled everything out and we shouldn't be here today. But we are, because God's in charge. And now I read in the Newsweek, a magazine, that China has built the largest radio telescope in the world. It's 1,600 feet in diameter. And what they want to do is search for alien life, the deepest parts of space. Okay, deep space, near space, outer space. It doesn't matter how many planets they discover, I guarantee you that God's law is still in effect. And where you will find a planet, you will find certain things that never change. Physical laws of science remain the same. Universal laws will operate 20 billion light years away, just as they operate here. This is the way God has created things. I have an airline mechanic, I guess I can call him a friend. He works at Metro Airport, and he repairs or replaces engines for commercial jets. And one day we were talking about it, and just a minute. Somebody get the back door, please. Thank you. So one day we were talking about his job, and with a smile, he said to me, "You know, Bill, no matter what they do in the form of maintenance on these jets, when they take off, sooner or later, they will always land." I said, well, that's because there's a universal law, the law of gravity. It hasn't been repealed. The law of gravity is still on the books. There are certain universal laws that govern how we live, that govern our world. And these universal laws affect us, how we live, our physical being. God planned it that way. The laws of physical life are still in effect. You give birth to a child and he's healthy, and you feed him and he grows up, and you nurture him and love him, and they grow. It's a law. It's God's law. He put it into our being. And in Psalm 90:10, there comes a day when we die. 70 years are given to us, God's word says. Some even live to be 80. But even the best years are filled with pain and trouble. Soon they disappear and we fly away. I read this verse, I was thinking about some of you. You asked me, well, how are you doing, Bill? Well, I have stage 4 cancer. I know that. And the doctors have told me you've got 2 to 5. I'm banking on 5 to 10, maybe longer. But you know what? I'm okay with 70 years. God gave me 70 years. I might live to be 80. And then I enter into eternity. That's a pretty good deal. God's eternal law is in effect today. Woody Allen once said, it's not that I'm afraid to die, I just don't want to be there when it happens. We will be there, I guarantee you. We will be there when it happens. We're all going to die. It's part of God's plan. His law, his wall that really protects us. In Romans 1:20, it reads, "For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, so they have no excuse for not knowing God. Life, death, our world, even the universe to a billion light years away, there is an external revelation of God and his laws, God and his wall. These laws are communicated to man through the Bible, and as an internal revelation, God reveals to us in our consciousness that there are things that are right and there are things that are wrong. So we have no excuse when it comes to knowing God and keeping the law. No excuse. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been following this Harvey Weinstein thing. And I'll be honest with you, it sickens me. And as of today, I believe there have been 79 accusers, all claiming that they've been sexually assaulted or sexually harassed. And I read this in the paper last week, and I was infuriated. A spokesman for Weinstein. Any allegations for non-consensual sex are unequivocally denied by Mr. Weinstein. I'm sorry, but I'm having a hard time believing that. And Weinstein, if he goes to trial and there is a jury and he is found not guilty, Weinstein's moral life is still governed by God's law. His conscience was speaking to him every time he did something that was wrong. Every moment that he violated God's commandment, God's Holy Spirit spoke to him, pricked his heart. To ignore the wall of bad behavior is wrong. He may get away with it, but not in God's eyes. There'll be a day when he'll stand before God and give an account for his actions, and they're wrong. They're sin. Oswald Chambers wrote, "At the heart, men are antagonistic to the lordship of Jesus Christ." Harvey Weinstein is antagonistic toward God. And anyone else that would perpetrate some of the things that he did. And now we're seeing all kinds of revelations. It's unending in government. Oh. I had this, it just bothers me, the kind of world we live in. And breaking the laws of life and conduct, I want to talk about that. Something we need to remember. Every law by which our life is hedged about, protected by a law, bears with it a penalty for breaking the law, for breaking down God's law. Looking again at our ancient vineyard, a potential thief, vision this. Here's this thief, and he's determined he's going to break the law of stealing, and he's going to break into a vineyard, and he's going to gather up a lot of grapes and get away with it. And so he attempts to climb the wall. And the very first thing that happens to him is that a thorn from the thorn bush pierces his hand. Ow! And it starts to bleed. And there's the warning right there. You better stop right now where you're at. I can't imagine anyone foolish enough to try to climb over this fence and get ripped up by the thorn bushes. And that first prick on his hand is a warning to stop. In the spiritual world, there is a grace from God, and I call it a prevenient grace. God's grace going out and telling you before you get any further, you need to stop what you're going to do. God's grace is at work. It's a universal law. It has not been repealed. Susie read this in Titus chapter 2. For the grace of God has been revealed, bringing salvation to all people. And we are instructed to turn from godless living and sinful pleasures. We should live in this evil world with wisdom, righteousness, and devotion to God. This is prevenient grace. It's the grace from which God has been revealed. Another translation reads that this grace has appeared to all men. All men. Not just people who worship on Sunday morning or at a synagogue or at a mosque. All men. No excuses. You just can't stand before God and say, I didn't know. Hey, I never read the Bible. I never went to church. No one ever told me about grace. God's Spirit has to be faithful and speak to everyone. And he leads a person one step at a time in proportion to his or her obedience. God's grace. That's why you're here this morning. There was a day when something clicked and you thought, you know, I need to be in church. I need to get closer to the Creator. I need to learn more. This is God's grace in action, moving you along step by step. He wants you to learn more. He wants you to be more. But if you happen to be like the thief who's trying to scale a wall filled with bramble bushes and snakes, you're going to get hurt. God's grace is warning that your actions are wrong. I know I was a recipient of God's prevenient grace. I was 15 years old. We're living on the west side of Detroit, Verner and Junction area. And one of my best friends was a fellow by the name of Rick. He was about a year and a half older than I. And our big guy, over 6 foot, gangly, tough guy persona, you know. And he took me under his wing, and he was going to teach me how to be cool. When you're 15, you want to be cool. And so he tutored me in the fine arts of smoking, drinking, and cursing. He taught me words that I would never say in front of my parents. And he also taught me how to skip school. Before that, I had never skipped school. And we were at I think it was a drugstore. These are back in the ancient days when they had soda fountains and a counter, you know. And so we were at this, we'd skipped school and we were at this place and we had a Coke and each and we had our cigarettes and we were both smoking a cigarette, which you could do back then in a place of business. Picture Happy Days in the Fonz, that was us. And so we skipped school and we're sitting there and he leans over to me and whispers, "Bill, I have been casing this nearby warehouse. Small appliances inside, TVs, radios. They only have one old guard and he falls asleep and it's easy to break in and we can get in this place and take what we want and it's going to be good." And he set the date. 2 nights. We're going to meet. I said, "Okay, Rick, I'm in, because I want to be cool." That night, in my bedroom, I'm laying in bed thinking about it. And I am agonizing over this. I'm being tormented, in fact. I thought, this is grand larceny. I mean, the police, they're going to catch us. They're going to take me downtown. I'm going to get booked and fingerprinted. But what scared me the most, what is my mother going to think about this? The next day I met him in school and I said, "Rick, I can't do this. I'm not a criminal. You're going to have to do that without me." Now what's going on? The grace of God speaking to my young heart and telling me, wrong, don't do it. You're going to get in trouble. I experienced His grace at the age of 15, striving with my heart. This grace is present so that we listen and obey. It's a protective wall for us so that we don't get in trouble and we enjoy life. And our verse reminds us, when you demolish an old wall, when you break down that wall, you're going to get bitten by a snake. Which brings me to my last point, breaking the law, physical, mental, or moral. And really that's what it means to tear down the wall, to be disobedient to God's will. Reading the paper again last week, find an interesting article about the North Dakota oil pipeline. There's a fellow named Chase Iron Eyes. He's an American Indian, and he's an activist. And he's accused of inciting a riot during and protesting against this pipeline in Dakota. And he's facing 5 years in prison if he's convicted in a trial. And the trial takes place in February of next year. Chase is going to plead not guilty. He says he will seek to present a necessity defense, justifying a crime by arguing that it prevented a greater harm, the pipeline. And he hopes to show that civil disobedience was his only option in stopping the construction of the pipeline, which they did finally finish. I read this and I thought, well, you know what? That sounds like a noble cause, you know? And you may sympathize with an Indian activist. I do. I sympathize with him. And the jury might find him not guilty. But I'm reading the article and they're saying legal experts believe his defense is a long shot. And he's probably going to lose and he'll go to prison and he will serve up to 5 years because he willfully broke the law. Now, we may not like this. He won't like it, but it's still the law. Now, regarding God's law, there are some things we may not like about God's law. Come on. But it's the law. And the wall around us is meant to protect us. Now, some of us, we go around and we justify wrong actions. We try to argue with God. Well, I had to do it this way, God. I know it's wrong, but this is why I did this thing. It's still the law. And when we break the law, there's a penalty. In James 4:17, it says, remember, it is sin to know what you ought to do and then not to do it. That is a powerful verse. There's no wiggle room with God. And that means that the wall is there for a reason. The thief 3,000 years ago who pushes past the thorns and attempts to tear down the wall will be bitten by a poisonous snake. And listen, back then, if you were bitten by a poisonous snake, you died. Period. So to live apart from God is a spiritual death. We can't afford it. A number of years ago, there was an experiment I read about. I was in a psychology class in college, and we studied this group of psychologists at an elementary school. Around the playground of this school was a very high fence, all around the playground. And when the children were released for recess to go out and play, they were accustomed to having that fence. So psychologists decided we're going to remove it and give the kids some freedom. You know, it's so confining, this fence. So they removed the wall and they observed the children. Suddenly, they all gathered at the center of the playground. And some of them were frightened because suddenly the fence is gone and they can't go out there because it's the unknown. And what do you do during recess if you don't have a fence to protect us? Really, really interesting. I thought, you know, that's the way we need to raise our kids. There are certain parameters we put around our children. There are things they can do. There are things they cannot do. I think that's what protected me when I was growing up. I knew that if I did something wrong, I was breaching the wall. Good parents give their children parameters. And that is not happening today in families. We have this philosophy that, well, you know, we have to give them freedom to develop and explore and experience things and let them find out for themselves. No! There are some things they don't need to experience. Isn't that right, John?
Absolutely.
That's right. He's a teacher. He knows. He comes in contact with kids. They don't know their parameters. There are no parameters anymore. And so we're raising children that are unruly, and we can't understand why. And they won't behave in class. You got to keep the 10 Commandments. You can't say, well, I'm going to ignore the one, thou shalt not. No. In Matthew 22, verse 37, Jesus said, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. Why? because this is a wall for us, and it protects us. And if we stay within the parameters, then you enjoy life, and you're happy, and one day experience life everlasting. Well, I had to get all this off my chest, because I'll be honest with you, you read the papers and it really gets depressing, and you wonder, where on earth is our world going, and what have we become as a society? Our entire existence is set about by walls. We are bound by laws, God's laws, meant for our well-being. We don't want to be a people mentioned in Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verse 8. Because when you demolish that wall, you could be bitten by a snake. And amen.